So this is the third video of my three-part video series about launching a supplement brand into Canada. And in Canada, they don't call them dietary supplements, they call them natural health products. And today I want to talk about the similarities between the US FDA requirements versus the Health Canada natural health product requirements. We're going to talk about the differences between the two agencies. And then for those of you that are thinking about launching a brand into Canada or perhaps expanding into Canada from the US, I want to share my considerations that I think will help drive your strategy and your approach. So let's get going. The big takeaway here is that the expectations from either agency, either the FDA or Health Canada, they're very similar in approach. And one example of this is finding a reliable manufacturer. They expect you to have a GMP compliant manufacturer make your products. And GMP compliance is a huge, wide scope of requirements. Everything from allergen control to raw material testing, to pallet control, traffic flow, HVAC systems, water systems. There's a whole bunch of production and production related items that need to be factored in. It has to be properly documented. There's a lot when it comes to GMP requirements, and they're expecting you to use a manufacturer that is meeting those requirements. Another example is finished product testing. Both countries expect you to test for microbial contaminants, chemical contaminants, maybe allergen contaminants, but then there's other things like identification, potency. Those are all big key parameters that both agencies will require you to test your finished product on. And yeah, there are some exceptions where some of these test parameters may not apply to you, but for the most part, from a purely expectation standpoint, they are expecting you to fulfill this requirement. The next thing is shelf life testing. So if your product has a best before date or an expiration date, both agencies are expecting you to have substantiation to prove your shelf life. And that means having data. That means testing your product across that shelf life to prove that it is stable and can meet your expiration date or best before date. And this is called stability data. Now, such testing can be quite costly, no doubt, but just know that it is required if you do have a best before date or an expiration date on your product. The next similarity is the expectation of having label compliance. All right, so your products need to be properly labeled as per each country's regulatory requirements, and this is because they want to make sure that the customer is having a very consistent experience from brand to brand. They really want them to have the key core information from brand to brand. Yes, the design may look different, but where that information lives on the label, what information is provided, the level of information, the quantities, the transparency of your formula, that's all stipulated in the regulations, and you need to make sure that your labels are compliant with those requirements. And to that point, an extension of the labeling, of course, is the formula itself, right? And the government agencies expect you to have a viable formula that meets the requirements with regards to permitted claims, that meets the expectations of what it is to substantiate those claims. That means having permitted ingredients. That means having ingredients at the therapeutic dosages. It's super important that the formula is viable within the country's requirements. Now, there are a lot more other differences, such as recall SOPs, complaints handling and such. And I think a lot of these requirements fall on the brand owner, not the manufacturer. So that's something to keep in mind. But we're not going to dive into all of those. Just know that overall, the expectations of what you need to provide or have at the ready is very similar between the US FDA and Health Canada. Now let's dive into the differences. Really in the how of it all, as in how do we execute and prove the expectations of US FDA or Health Canada? And one good example is labeling, right? If you want to have compliant labels in the US, for example, all you need are English labels, right? With a supplement facts, and you're done. In some cases, if you want to, you could put Spanish on there, but it's not mandatory. On top of it, if you look at the US supplement facts, it looks very similar to a nutrition facts table. They have similar information on there, such as calories, carbohydrates, cholesterol. It's very similar looking to a nutrition facts for the most part. Yeah, there are some formatting differences, but the type of information, the level of information, the daily value, you can see the overlap in the approach there. And that's because the US requirements, the regulatory requirements for the US supplements fall under the food framework. But if you look at the Canadian labeling requirements right off the bat, you have English and French. That is mandatory. And then on top of it, you can see that there's a lot of differences here, right? There's a products facts table. The information presents medicinal ingredients and non-medicinal ingredients. And this is done on purpose because in Canada, the natural health product requirements fall under the subset of drug requirements. So it looks very similar to a drug. So right off the bat, the formatting differences, the way the information is presented, how it's presented is going to be very different. Now, another key component of your label is obviously the claims. And the claims are very different, all right? So the US FDA, like I said, is a subset of foods. So they're very restrictive in the types of claims you can make. Whereas with Health Canada, because the natural health products are a subset of drugs, there are some other claims that I feel are more drug-like that you are permitted to make. One example of this is the use of echinacea. And an echinacea product could have a claim something along the lines of helps to relieve the symptoms and shorten the duration of upper respiratory tract infections. Now that's for Canada. You can have that type of claim on your product. Whereas in the US, a word like infection is seen as a drug claim, and you're not permitted to have drug or disease claims for the most part on dietary supplements. Clearly, when it comes to labels, it's a huge point of differentiation between the two countries. And another big point of differentiation, and number two difference, is the go-to-market approval. When it comes to the US FDA, they don't require you to seek pre-approval by the FDA. And this is because the dietary supplements are a subset of foods. And just like foods, if I were to bake muffins, I can freely go sell them. I don't have to go to the FDA and get the muffins approved by them. I can just go to market. But of course, the expectation is that I am making this under food safe practices, under GMP requirements, properly labeling these muffins. I'm watching for allergens and all these other expectations, but I can freely go to the market. And if there's ever an issue later down the road, or if FDA were to ever inquire, then I can provide all my proof and substantiation that they are requesting of me to FDA. So essentially, I can go to market, and any proof or substantiation I can provide to them after I go to market. Whereas it's very different in Canada. In Canada, it's requiring you to have appropriate licensing at the manufacturing level, at the importer level, and at the product level. All right, so at all three levels, you're going to need licensing, and that needs to be coming in from Health Canada prior to you going to market. And one of the big ones here is product licensing, right? What does that entail? It means you have to reveal your formula, you have to reveal the amounts of the ingredients, you're going to have to reveal your claims, you have to provide all the safety and efficacy evidence and clinical trials and papers to Health Canada in a dossier. You're going to have to provide your test parameters, you have to provide your label. There's so much information you have to provide up front. And here's the thing, there's a time constraint. You're at the mercy of them getting back to you on time. That's number one. But also number two is that they're very hands-on. They may have feedback about the label claims. They may have feedback about adding risk information. They may have feedback about your ingredients and the amounts, and you have to add more, you have to take away ingredients, and now you have to relay that back to the manufacturer. And this is before you even sold a single thing, right? And you're spending money on this activity alone. And I'm not even talking about cost recovery fees or the fees to license. I'm just talking about you talking to your consultant, you talking to your manufacturer. Maybe that changes the cost dynamic of the formula. There's just so much involved. And on top of it, now that Health Canada is thinking about adding these fees to licensing, it's another added burden. It's a huge investment, which leads us to the next section, which is, what should you do if you are thinking about launching into Canada versus the US, or maybe you're a US brand trying to launch into Canada? And the big thing here is, the first thing you need is proof of concept. I think before you go into Canada, you want to make sure that your idea is viable, that there is legitimate demand, and that the math actually works, right? The profit and losses, the P&L actually works, and that there is a path to profitability for you. And I would say that you need proof of concept, and there's a couple ways of gathering that. That could be anything from just talking to your friends and your family and your network and your colleagues, and just trying to get that consumer market data to see if you've got a real product or not. And I would also argue that another method of proof of concept is to just launch in the US. And by launching in the US, it's going to force your hand at really building out your business and making sure you have a truly viable product. And then from there, saving up those profits to pay for all the costs needed to get your product into Canada. That said, there are some differences here that you still have to factor in. Number one is the formulation differences, ingredient differences, and just know that whatever you make in the US might not be suitable for Canada. So if you are thinking about launching a product in both countries, you probably want to formulate with someone, i.e. me, where we consider both requirements so that your formulation can be agile enough to go into both countries. And if you are a US brand that's already established and are thinking about expanding into Canada, that's the big takeaway right there. You can't assume that your US product can easily get in to Canada and that the formula can be easily transported into that country and is compliant with that country's laws. That's usually not the case. And there's also a time component. You may have already set in your calendar what your launch date in Canada could be, or maybe a retail launch in Canada. Unfortunately, you need to factor in the Health Canada component because that could really throw a wrench into those launch dates. And this is probably why you see a lot of brands out there that have all these different flavors and varieties and formulas that are in the US, but they're not in Canada. This is tied to the Canadian requirements. Now, the argument, of course, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some would argue that it's a good thing, as in Health Canada requirements are more stringent, therefore it's protecting its consumers better. And then it could also be a bad thing, meaning that it's over-regulated and it's actually overstepping on things and there's a lot of red tape and politics behind it all. Now, if it were me and I'm considering whether I want to launch in Canada versus the US, knowing all the regulations, for me, I would go with the US, understand the consumer demographic, how to speak to them, make sure that I have a viable product. The whole idea here is proof of concept. And then saving that money, a portion of that money, of the profits, into a regulatory budget for Canada, and then working with a consultant to start that process. It's a 2-year process. You should budget about 2 years to launch into Canada. So you want to start right away. Get your submission in, get your licensing in, maybe get your manufacturer all ready for that as well, and then start the process. And during those 2 years, continue with my US business and see how that goes, how to grow that. Then I get my NPN number, my product license number from Health Canada, and then get ready for the Canadian launch. It's a huge endeavor. It's a lengthy endeavor. And this is something that we help our clients with all the time. And particularly, we help them formulate for both countries. We help them set up claims for both countries and also navigate the licensing itself and dealing with Health Canada and all these fun things. That said, there are a ton of videos that I want you to watch, especially if you are thinking about launching in Canada or the US. A lot of the information applies to both countries, so definitely check these videos out. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.